Last week, I sat on the panel of a debate at my university. It was just an extracurricular debate, and one of the topics was DEI. So on this panel, there were 3 individuals opposing on the liberal side and 3 on the conservative side, and then an audience from this particular school's organization. And on the topic of DEI, one of the things that I had suggested was that maybe one of the reasons, just maybe one of the reasons why Black people are not performing as well as white populations are is because they have significantly less fathers in the home. And I thought that maybe this would be met with maybe a little bit of scorn or a little bit of agreement or something of that sort. But instead, the entire audience, filled mainly with Black people, laughed at me. And I was a little bit shocked because I kind of thought that we all had this same agreement that yes, having a father in the home is one of the #1 highest signifiers of whether or not a child will succeed. But apparently I was wrong. Now, if you've been following politics in the last couple of years, in the last couple of months even, you've probably noticed that DEI, diversity, racism, all of this talk has been incredibly prominent. And so what we're going to be doing today, we're going to be discussing DEI. We're going to be going beyond some of just the conservative headlines, as that's the point of the show. We're going to be doing a little bit of a deeper dive so that the rest of the show, in future episodes, I can talk more about racism, more about what is going on in society, in this culture. A couple episodes ago, we talked about the road to genocide, and we talked about how that's closely tied to racism. So today I want to talk about DEI. We're going to talk about its relation to affirmative action, Marxism, why we don't need DEI, and then some of its failings, as well as what our response as Christians should be to DEI initiatives. So let's go ahead and first start with what the history of DEI is. Now, if you don't know what DEI is, it stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I recently actually had a friend ask me what even DEI stood for, and it did kind of shock me how different our worlds were, in just that mine has been politics for the past 5, 6, 7 years in following politics. So DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and on its face, it sounds really nice. It sounds like a great program, great initiatives to help strengthen the country, right? That's what they would like you to believe. And basically what this is establishing different quotas, saying, okay, in this department, we want to have at least 50% Black people. In this department, we want to have at least 20% Hispanics, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. Its goal, its intention, its aim, as we have been told, is to help include more minorities, more historically disadvantaged groups. Okay, now before we had DEI has come about on the scene in the past 20-ish years. We actually had affirmative action. Affirmative action was put into place in the 60s by our good friend Lyndon B. Johnson. And Lyndon B. Johnson is kind of hailed nowadays as a civil rights activist, a civil rights hero. And we are told that we should all, bow down to the great progress that was made during Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. Okay, his Great Society sounds great, except that it's not. And a really fantastic book that outlines some of the racist ideologies and the racist thought processes of LBJ is actually by Candace Owens. It's called Blackout. Now, she's come under a lot of scorn recently, lots of criticism. And whether or not, whatever you think about Candace Owens, her book, Blackout, is really an excellent read, and I would highly suggest it. It's really very different than a lot of her more recent work. And so in this book, she shows the racist motivations of the Democrat Party in tying the Black vote to them for the next 50, 85 years. One of the books she cites is by Robert Caro, Master of the Senate Civil Rights Legislation. And in this book, he details a lot of Lyndon B. Johnson's actual personality, who he actually was, including his referral to the civil rights legislation as the N-word bill. Okay, except he wasn't saying N-word, he said what it actually was. He also detailed how Robert Parker, who was LBJ's chauffeur, recalled a very interesting story about LBJ. LBJ, who we all thought was the hero of the Black people. No, instead, he asked his chauffeur, okay, would you rather be referred to by your name, or would you rather be referred to as boy, slave, or the N-word? And when his chauffeur affirmed, yes, I would rather be called by my name, this is what LBJ said. As long as you're Black, and you're going to be black until the day that you die, no one's going to call you by your goddamn name. So no matter what you are called, N-word, you just let it roll off your back like water. And you'll make it. Just pretend you're a goddamn piece of furniture. That is what LBJ said to his black chauffeur, okay? LBJ was not a hero of the black people. Affirmative action was not this piece of legislation that was suddenly going to rise black people out of this pit of racial injustice. Lyndon B. Johnson, in fact, was a member of the Southern Bloc, which was basically a group of senators, a group of representatives that would vote against every single piece of civil rights legislation while they were in the Senate. The only reason that this flipped, according to Candace Owens' book Blackout and Robert Caro and other biographers, is because Lyndon Johnson understood the power that this civil rights movement had, the power that the black community had in flipping seats. So he wanted to give them a little bit. But the glory and the beauty of this affirmative action, which is basically the older version of DEI, is that it ties black people to the government. It ties them independence to the government. And not just black people, any minority that's affected by this affirmative action, by these quotas that we have, okay? So that is the history, that is the original intention by the people who passed this civil rights activist legislation. Not necessarily by the people who campaigned for it. I haven't studied into a lot of that history as much. I'm sure there was a lot of good intention by the people who voted for this, by maybe even people in LBJ's administration. But the fact of the matter is that LBJ, the individual who signed this piece of legislation into law, affirmative action, did it because he wanted black people to be voting for Democrats as long as they could. That is what is outlined in Blackout and in many other biographers of LBJ. Now, what's so wrong about DEI? Why is it bad that LBJ passed this? Not just because he was racist, but what are the other ties that DEI has? Okay, so DEI, as I've stated before, looks at quotas. It's looking at how many black people do we have, how many minorities do we have in relation to other white people or other races? What is the ratio here? What is the quotas that we're reaching, right? And so what we're looking at here is we're not looking at the outcomes of the product, right? We're simply looking at the outcomes of the people. We are looking at what aesthetic kind of standard that we can put over some company, over some program in order to make it look like we have better diversity. What does this remind you of? Okay, if you're not familiar with Marxism, it might not remind you of Marxism, but it is very closely tied to Marxism and the ideas of Marxism, okay? Because what is Marxism? Marxism does not look at the starting point. DEI does not look at the starting point. It doesn't look at what are you doing with what you have been given. Instead, it looks at where are we going to get you? That's what equity is. That's what the difference between equality versus equity. Equity is, in fact, the very core value of Marxism. This is what Karl Marx had to write about Marxism. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeoisie right be crossed in its entirety and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Okay, so this is kind of all of this beautiful poetry that we're writing about really a very evil program, a very evil ideology. Marxist Karl Marx was very known for a number of different quotes, and as I was looking over them in preparation for the show, some of them really struck me as very interesting. Things like, where atheism begins, communism begins. Okay, so communism, this Marxist ideology, is from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, distributing out to the needs of people. Okay, you need a job, you're going to get a job. That's the type of thing that Karl Marx advocated for. It focuses on outcomes. Okay, Karl Marx also discussed doing whatever you want to do in your day. He didn't like this idea of a capitalistic market in which everyone is specialized in their own kind of areas of expertise. He instead remarked that he wanted to maybe be a fisherman in the afternoon and a critic of critics in the evening, that type of thing. Throughout the day, he just wanted to shift and go wherever he wanted to, which of course we all know logically, if you think about it, is a really inefficient way to run a society. If we're all trying to put ourselves into all these different types of categories, we're really going to get nothing done. Okay, and so DEI, just like Marxism, is focused on outcomes. It's not focused on the quality of the product. It's not focused on improving the quality of the individual. It is focused on an aesthetic over a program. Okay, and this inherently has failed. Inherently, it has failed. It's a paternalistic policy that has done nothing to improve our quality in society, has done nothing to improve the Black community, has done nothing to improve our collaboration together, but instead has failed America time and time again. And we are now, I think, beginning to wake up and understand this ideology, but I believe it is beginning to take roots in some other ways. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the failings of DEI. And there is pretty much no better summarization and ideology and thought laid out than Supreme Court Justice Thomas Clarence. He wrote 2 different opinions for Supreme Court decisions, and one of this is from Adirond Constructors versus Pena 5151 U.S. 200. This was written in 1995. This is what he had to say about affirmative action and DEI and these type of quota legislations. There can be no doubt that the paternalism that appears to lie at the heart of this program is at war with the principle of inherent equality that underlies and infuses our Constitution. But there can be no doubt that racial paternalism and its unintended consequences can be as poisonous as any other form of discrimination. So-called benign discrimination teaches many that because of the chronic and apparently immutable handicaps, minorities cannot compete with them without their patronizing indulgence. Inevitably, such programs endanger attitudes of superiority, or alternatively, provoke resentment among those who believe that they have been wronged by the government's use of race. These programs stamp minorities with a badge of inferiority and may cause them to develop dependencies or to adopt an attitude that they are entitled to preferences. Okay, that is what Thomas Clarence had to say. A Black man who rose to one of the greatest ranks in the United States. That is what he had to say about these quotas. It is a paternalistic policy. It says that Black people cannot succeed in our country without the help of the government, without the help of legislation to put them into a career, to put them into a scholarship program or a school or something like that. And it is remarkably untrue, okay? Because DEI and affirmative action were supposed to be temporary measures. They were not supposed to be put into place for a long time. Originally, the intent was to put them into place, get a leg up, maybe we have this argument that, well, Black people cannot succeed because their parents weren't able to succeed because of racism, okay? So it's supposed to be temporary. It's supposed to help people get into different schools, help them to get an education. Then that education would help them get a job. That job would help them allow their children to get better educations, and so on and so forth. And then the measures would be repealed. Okay, but as I reminded you, affirmative action was originally established during Lyndon B. Johnson's administration. Okay, so this was the 1960s. We have been seeing affirmative action measures being put into place all over the country since then. Until the overturn of the Supreme Court recently in 2020. All right, it was supposed to be temporary. So the argument that DEI is going to help put Black people forward is just completely obsolete, right? And as Charlie Kirk pointed out, Jewish people who had slavery much more recently than Black people in the Holocaust, who were half of their people group were wiped out, are doing much better. In fact, one of the most successful people groups are Jewish and Asians. And we put Japanese people into internment camps during World War II. So both of these people groups, which have experienced harsh measures against them, are doing just fine. They are doing just fine. So this idea that Black people need a leg up, that they need the government to help them, is in fact a paternalistic policy. And it only hurts the very people that it claims to help. All right. Now, let's say, hypothetically speaking, that we then, convince all of the Democrats, all the liberals, all the people pushing for this, that no one is racist anymore. We don't need DEI, et cetera, et cetera. Well, unfortunately, there's still de facto racism. It's a new kind of racism that you've probably never heard of. And basically what it means is even if there's a neutral policy put into place, if that disproportionately affects a minority group, then that means that it's still racist. That means it's still racist. It's also called disparate impact liability. Okay, so it completely disregards the intention of the actual policy and focuses once again on the outcome. It's crazy how we come around to that again. All right, so one of these examples was actually Sheetz gas station was sued by the EEOC, okay, for discrimination. You might be asking yourself, why? What were they doing? Were they explicitly stating, no, we're not going to hire black people? Were they only hiring white people and turning down law school graduates and business school graduates to come work at their gas station? No. Instead, Jonathan Berry, who is the managing partner at Boyd & Gray, who spoke on behalf of Sheetz gas station and against the EEOC, had to say this. This is why they were being sued by the EEOC. Meanwhile, the EEOC has brought suit against employers facially neutral policies that allegedly impose a disparate impact on minority groups. Most prominently, the EEOC has alleged that Sheetz, the convenience store company, has violated Title VII with its long-standing practice of conducting criminal background checks of potential employees. The EEOC has not alleged that Sheetz has intentionally treated people of one race differently than people of another. Instead, the suit argues the background check policy is unlawful because it has a disparate impact on racial minorities. Notably, the EEOC has not, to my knowledge, sued any employer for imposing college degree requirements, which may create a similar disparate impact on minorities. Okay. This is what the EEOC was trying to do. They were saying, because you are putting forth a background check, and there are a high number of black people that have committed crimes that would then disbar them from employment, you are being racist. That is how far DEI has gone. To say that we must employ people with criminal backgrounds in order to help the black community. Okay, that is the most racist thing I have ever heard. That in order to help the black community, I mean, what? What? No, this is ridiculous. This is absolutely absurd, and it is dangerous. It is a dangerous ideology to think that we should then take away our safety, take away our own personal safety for us, for our children, and for our community, in order to apologize for something that we never did, in order to apologize for a racism that we never held. That is what this is. And one thing that I really want to make very clear here. When I was researching for this, I found someone on Twitter in a podcast that had alleged this, and I couldn't find the primary source. I couldn't find, an actual article citing this. No matter how many times I looked up Sheetz gas station versus EEOC, what is the lawsuit going on here? Every mainstream article that I read was saying that Sheetz gas station was being discriminatory, and EEOC was saying, well, they're not meeting the quotas. That's what they're saying. That's the problem here. It wasn't until I found this article, I think I had to go to AI and specifically state, exactly what I was looking for, that I found the statement by Jonathan Berry, who previously worked in the Trump administration, who was, I think, a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Okay, he's worked in a lot of these areas before, who gave a statement to the United States government that telling everyone what this exactly was. So this is how the mainstream media has lied to us about DEI, about many different measures, but especially about DEI, telling us something that it was not. Okay, so that is one of the failures of DEI, is the amount of safety that we are compromising. But it doesn't stop there. There was a viral fire chief that a video of her exploded over the internet because people were very concerned. She did an interview talking about the advantages of DEI and the advantages of diversity in the fire department. Okay? And one of the things that she stated was that she said this in her own words. And the first time I saw it, I thought it was AI. I was so confused. I said, surely this must be satire. This has to be the Babylon Bee. Surely, please let it be the Babylon Bee. Okay? No. What she said was, people will say, can you carry my husband out of a fire? Right? Which honestly is kind of a valid question to ask a female fire chief. Women are just not as strong as men. It's just a fact. Do you know how many times I've beat a man in an arm wrestling competition in a race? Never. Okay, there's women that can do it. I'm not one of those women. And so This is what the fire chief's response to "Can you carry my husband out of a fire" is. If I have to carry your husband out of a fire, then he got himself in the wrong place. That is your job. That is your job as a fire chief. Okay, so we're putting people in risk. We are putting them in harm's way for an aesthetic. That is what DEI is. That is what it is. But it doesn't stop there. It does not stop there. It keeps coming, all of the failings of DEI. All right, so James O'Keefe exposed earlier this year this kind of pass-through fraud of what was happening. He met up with an individual who was basically acting as a middleman. So the Small Business Administration, which I didn't even know existed before researching this, there's just so many government organizations, but the Small Business Administration has, since the 1960s, established that they will give out government contracts to any disadvantaged business, okay? And so from the 1960s to 1986, they had to have some kind of proof of racial discrimination or some proof of being disadvantaged. But in 1986, they let go of all of those measures and then put forth, you know what? This country is racist enough. All you have to do that you are a disadvantaged business is be at least 51% owned by a racial minority. Just a racial minority, okay? So ignoring the fact that there are many white people that are poorer than black people and so forth, all you have to do is just be 51% black. And so what James O'Keefe discovered here, he sits down with an individual who has gotten a government contract through simply being 51% owned by a black man. But the black man wouldn't actually do anything for the organization. He's simply a front man, shows up to some meetings, has some share in the company, profits off of it, and then the rest of it, the back end, is completely done by white people or a different racial group, whatever. Okay. And there was actually an Ultima lawsuit about this because people were upset about this. Hey, this is not fair. You're giving out contracts to people who did not actually deserve it and who were not actually disadvantaged. And so through discovery in this lawsuit, there was a lot that was going on. And the Small Business Administration admitted a little bit of their mistake, and they made some changes. And you might be thinking, okay, either this policy was eliminated, or maybe they were saying, okay, we're actually going to check for some level of discrimination against this business. No, instead what was changed was that this is what was changed. If their net worth exceeds $850,000, their adjusted gross income exceeds $400,000, or their total assets exceed $6.5 million, then they would be excluded from being a disadvantaged business. Okay, those are the standards. I don't know a single person who would go above those standards. I don't know a single person who has a net worth of exceeding, I believe, to my knowledge, exceeding $850,000 or anything like this. This is an insane, and this is for the person. This is not for the company. Okay, so this is an insane standard to apply to being disadvantaged. Clearly, there are people that are accepting and getting these contracts that are profiting from government money, from your taxpayer dollars, who have not actually been disadvantaged, okay? Some of these are $100 million deals, as the one that was exposed by James O'Keefe, okay? So there's, not only is your safety being put at risk, not only is there a lot of fraud going on, but the military intelligence, okay? The safety within the military is also being put at risk, okay? And so in an article from the Daily Wire called Cigarettes, DEI in Our Military, they actually exposed that 44% of women failed this Army combat fitness test. It was a new test that was put in place that was going to try to align more closely with what was going on with combat, what was going to be needed from the soldiers. So they put this new test into place, and about 44% of women would fail it, compared to 7% of men. So what did they do? They said, oh, you know what? We're going to lower the standards for women. We're going to lower the quality of standards for women. And I then went ahead, I looked at it, I cross-referenced this. The Hill reported on the exact same thing. And I quoted this in my debate on university campus. And the panel just told me that that was not accurate, that that wasn't true, that I was either making up evidence or the evidence was faulty. And I thought that was really funny because it's very clear in front of you. You can look at many different articles, but the Hill is not a very, conservative-leaning institution. So they completely revised some of the tests. They used new scoring scales. The men still had to do a lot of more difficult tests, but the women were kind of let off the hook. The US military doesn't care who's out there fighting alongside your brother, your father, your uncle, or your husband. What they care about is their ads, where they get to go, oh, look, we have women. Diversity is our strength. Except it's actually not. It is diversity, especially in the terms of the military, is specifically not our strength. They literally said you do not have to be as strong to be in the military because we want diversity. Okay? So anytime someone says diversity is our strength, I want you to quote them that. I want you to tell them, no, actually diversity is not always our strength. And a lot of times it's actually not our strength. Our strength is actually having good standards, is meritocracy, is telling people, no, I'm sorry, you need to be better. You need to work on yourself. Okay? Now, when all of these DEI policies were floating around, Charlie Kirk and Tucker Carlson both went viral for two very different reasons. There was small clips of what they said that went viral. They both referred to their fears about, going on a plane and maybe there's a female black pilot being on the plane. They said, I'm gonna hope. Hopefully she's skilled enough to be flying this plane. Hopefully she's a quality pilot. And these went viral. People were like, oh my goodness, they're so racist. They're so racist. No one actually looked at the full clip. No one actually looked at the full context of what was going on. This is one of the reasons why going beyond the headlines is so incredibly important, because a lot of the conservative media groups didn't report on what was actually behind this. Okay, so I had to do a little bit of digging to figure out what was actually going on behind the context. So the context here is that the Federal Aviation Administration had discussed in 2013 lowering their standards, okay? They had actually been criticized for this in lowering some of their standards. And this was a screenshot that Charlie Kirk had posted. And in it, the Federal Aviation Administration put, okay, what are the relative values of diversity in the prediction of performance outcomes? Then they said there is a trade-off between adverse impact, and predicted job performance outcomes. So right there, they just admitted that you cannot have both. You cannot have diversity and you cannot have meritocracy. You can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too. They then ask, directly below this line, how much of a change in job performance is acceptable to achieve what diversity goals? The government administration that is responsible for overseeing your safety as you fly through the sky, as you're being landed in the busyness of airplanes landing everywhere, is asking, how much can we maybe shift down our standards in order to make sure that more disadvantaged groups are able to pursue their dreams? What about the minority groups on the planes? What about the black people that are on do they not get to have safety? Is this not, no, we're just going to let everyone pursue their dreams, be happy, go about their days. It doesn't matter what's happening, if the planes crash. Sorry if your loved ones die. At least now it's not all white men crashing planes. We could have a couple more disadvantaged groups in there, okay? So Charlie Kirk and Tucker Carlson's position here is that not only is this not good for safety, but it's also not fair to those who actually did the work. It's not fair to the black individuals, the black women that are actually good pilots. Because if you enforce all these DEI measures, if you lower the standards, now they can't say, yeah, well, I actually did pass this same higher standard as all of the older, white male pilots did back in the day when we cared about skill when flying massive, huge planes through the sky. Okay, and now Other people still criticize this, saying, okay, well, the FFA, never actually changed some of the regulations. And there's a bit of dispute about that, about whether or not the FAA actually changed things. But even if they did not, let's say they never even had this discussion in the first place, the FAA passing these tests acts like a learner's permit, okay? Every single airline above that understands what it takes to fly an airplane within their airline. And they then impose further regulations above that. Further regulations that require more skill. Okay, that's why we have a huge difference in the different airlines. Well, one of the reasons why you have a huge difference in different airlines, okay? And so the airlines, including American Airlines, had said that they were going to impose a 50% quota. A 50% quota of trying to get minority groups. They were really concerned. And previously, it had been like less than 10% of minority groups versus white people flying planes. Okay, and those minority groups include women. So it's like a very large number of white men flying planes. But as the FAA, okay, the government administration overseeing all of this flying and standards, literally said that there is a trade-off, okay? Because when you are hiring people for a job, there has to be some level of discrimination. You can't hire everyone to be an airline pilot. Even though Karl Marx wants us all to, in the morning go own a coffee shop and then in the evening be a pilot. But you can't hire everyone. You have to discriminate in some way, shape, or form. And if you try to employ every single discrimination measure, then you're not going to end up discriminating against anyone, right? It's a similar thing, people say, oh, well, it's okay that I hate people because I hate everyone. I hate everyone in my family. Okay, well, then you're not actually imposing, one level of hatred above someone else, right? Still doesn't make it okay. But if we try to employ diversity as well as meritocracy, the idea that you need to be more skilled in order to land the job, then we're not actually going to be valuing meritocracy. You have to choose. You have to choose. And so if we're going to be saying that we're going to be shooting for 50% minority groups, then by logic, you have to then decrease your standard of quality, okay? So this is the problem with DEI. It doesn't work. It puts a Band-Aid. This is what Thomas Clarence told it. I've talked a lot about how this is a Band-Aid, an aesthetic put over a wound. That is exactly what it is. It doesn't actually fix the problem. It hurts us all. And it hurts the very groups that it's claiming to help. So the next question is, let's go ahead and give more funding to schools. Now, first off, giving more funding to schools isn't necessarily DEI, in my personal opinion. The actual definition of DEI and what different policies are DEI initiatives would maybe differ from expert to expert. But let's say we give more funding to schools. And I watched a really interesting debate from Charlie Kirk and a Black student at one of his Prove Me Wrong events. And one of the things that he pointed out is that we have funneled so much funding into disadvantaged groups, into the groups that are struggling with socioeconomic factors, into Black neighborhoods. So much money has been funneled there. And what has it done? What has it done? Now, I'm not trying to suggest that we should stop funding these schools, that we should teach them a lesson or something like that. That's not what I'm trying to suggest at all. I think that teachers are underpaid. I think the whole system is completely broken. I was homeschooled. I loved it, right? I'm not a huge advocate of public schools, but I also don't want to completely defund them either, right? But one of Charlie Kirk's points was that if you don't have a father, it doesn't matter how much money you get. It's really not going to make a huge difference, okay? Statistically speaking, obviously not everyone is a statistic, and if you did not have a father in the home, if you had an absent father, you do not have to live by this statistic. You do not have to then go about and ruin your life. But this brings me back to my original point. I go into this auditorium, and as we're beginning to speak about all of these different matters, one of the girls looked at me, and I don't know what ethnicity she was, but she wasn't white. And she said, "You are coming at this from such a privileged point of view. You don't understand where we're coming from." I said, "Yes, you are absolutely correct. You are absolutely correct. I don't understand where you're coming from. I have an incredibly privileged point of view. I had both parents in the home. I had a father who loved me, and I was homeschooled. That is a lot of privilege for one person. I would personally call it blessings, but most people maybe wouldn't align themselves with that verbiage. I've been incredibly blessed as an individual. My parents made a lot of sacrifices to help me throughout my education. I probably wouldn't have gotten the opportunities that I did If my parents hadn't taught me to write well, if my parents hadn't taken me to speech and debate, I wouldn't be where I'm at right now, right? And so that's what I said. And the entire room laughed at me. And she said, why are you so obsessed with this idea of fathers? And I had prepared a lot of statistics for that evening, but I hadn't actually prepared any statistics about why it was important to have fathers in the home, because I had assumed that we all understood. I had assumed that we all understood that it's important to have a father who loves and supports you, right? And so I looked up some of these statistics from the Organization of Fathers. I don't remember exactly what the organization is called, but 80% of individuals who have a father in the home are less likely to go to jail. 90% of individuals that committed suicide did not have a father in the home. 71% of high school dropouts did not have a father in the home. And yet the Black community has been lied to. They have said the reason that they are not able to succeed is not because of the structural failures within the nuclear family in the Black family. It's not because the government asked you to please break up with your Black husband or not marry him and instead depend on the government. Don't depend on a man. You don't need a man. No, you need the government. You need the government to pay your bills. It has allowed men to get off the hook, to run away, and to no longer have to face responsibility. That is the failing. That is what we need to be looking at. What policy changes can we undo? That is the issue. DEI will not fix it. Now, what should our Christian response be to DEI? To the fact that obviously, yes, it is a fact that Black people by and large are much more disadvantaged than white people. Well, first, I would say that as Christians, we should be looking out for our neighbor. I don't think it's the government's job to step in and say, I'm going to give you this job, whether or not you deserve it. I'm going to give you all of this welfare money. But as Christians, the Bible throughout repeatedly says that we should look at our brother or sister who is not as fortunate as us, and we should do what we can to help them. That is our job. That is our responsibility. It's not the government's job. It is our job. It is our responsibility. But with that, let's not prioritize race. Let's not put this arbitrary definition of what disadvantaged or advantaged or blessed means. After I had finished the debate, one of my friends told me that he had grown up with just one father in the home. And he watched his Black neighbors get subsidies, get welfare benefits, get welfare checks, even though they were much more well off than him and his father, who were just scraping by. Let's not put an arbitrary standard over who the stranger on the street is and who needs help. Let us look at the need and do our Christian duty to help them. Okay, I would argue that yes, diversity is a strength. Diversity is a strength. The Lord said, "Be fruitful and multiply. Go to the ends of the earth." Okay. He then commanded us to go to every nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Every nation. The Lord is glorified when we reach out to the nations. The Lord is glorified when all of these different cultures, all of these different experiences, all of these different perspectives all have the same awe for His creation, for His character, for who He is. Diversity is a good thing. But forced diversity, this separation, this idea that we can see someone's race and then know their life experience based upon the color of their skin, is the most racist thing that we can do. That is the most racist thing, to look at a Black person and say, oh, I understand your life experience. I know what you've been through, and I'm going to give you a job because of it. And then ignore someone else who may need our help more. That is the most racist thing that we can do as Christians. And I do think that racism is an evil and vile thing, no matter who it is practiced against. So as we can see, DEI is not some measure that's going to, help Black people bounce back. It's going to help them come through. Instead, it is hurting the very people that it promised to help. And it is enslaving them to the government. It is making them dependent upon the Democrat politicians who we vote into office. It has ties to affirmative action. This is what Lyndon B. Johnson wanted all along. It has ties to Marxism, and we don't need it. It has put forth lots of fraud, and it is an unsafe policy. So as Christians, I urge you, we should not be standing up for DEI. We should not be going for these programs. It is not the Christ-like thing to do. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Beyond the Headlines. Please come back for another week. We're going to be diving a lot more into what racism is, but I wanted to use this episode as kind of a groundwork to understand where we're at now, because I do think that a lot of this thinking of outcomes and this type of thinking is really manifesting itself in a lot of different ways in our culture.